bring environmental and social justice issues to you in your favorite places like Coachella. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers today. So our first talk is going to be titled Mental Health, the Color of Everything. We are joined by Cory Richards, photographer, filmmaker, and author, moderated by Evan Pivnick, voice of the Firebirds. After this talk, please stick around because we have Plastique Tiara joining us. Plastique is a drag queen known from RuPaul's Drag Race. And we also have Jaden Smith coming here. Nice, small group, ask your questions. Please join us, tell your friends. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. I'm going to turn it over to Evan.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Glad everyone was able to wake up and be here with us today after hopefully a very long and exciting and fun night. I'm very happy to be alongside Cory Richards, whose book, The Color of Everything, will be coming out this June. But when someone writes a book, you have to know who's writing the book. And Cory, my first question to you today, to kick things off, is who are you?
All right, let's see here. Is this, there we go.
Yeah, who am I? I'm a guy with a microphone at this point.
That kind of works, yeah.
Yeah. So, my name is Cory. I took photographs for National Geographic for about 13 years. And I was a professional athlete. And when I say professional athlete, that was Himalayan climbing. So like Everest, that kind of stuff. And so I coupled those two careers. But really, I mean, the basis of that and really what my book is about is the trajectory that I've taken through life, which is, I was born in Utah and then, I skipped some grades, all this stuff. I was doing really well, and then somewhat catastrophically, I dropped out of high school. I was put in, mental institutions, and then rehabs, and then I was homeless for a while. And so this book is really about what happens in the brain and why we spin forward in the ways we do. So it's a lot of everything, but really, who am I? I'm still figuring that out. I'm very much so.
Well, you have a better, when the book does come out in June, you get an opportunity to read, you get to learn, and you do a lot of self-reflection. And I think that starts, and you start out, the book opens, you basically die on the mountain. That's on, spoiler alert, it doesn't die, which is fantastic and makes us able to be here today and speak with you. But you talk about growing up, you mentioned Utah, and kind of your family dynamic and how that kind of shaped you to be the person you are today, and also a lot of self-reflection after the fact. How self-aware were you at the time when you were younger, or what was going on, your relationship with your brother and your father and your mother, at the time compared to kind of how you see it now?
It's a really good question, and just to give you guys some background, what he's referring to is like, I grew up in a middle-class household, and from all external metrics, it was like a great household. My parents were very loving. Like, we had all of the things that you could kind of want, right? But internally, there are these dynamics that were taking place, and they're so deep-seated. And part of this is stuff that we just don't see until we're looking back on it in hindsight. So, my mom suffered from pretty severe postpartum depression with my brother, which causes what are called insecure attachments. And then she suffered from that again with me. And what that does is it creates sort of an emotional deficit where a child is looking for their parent or their primary caregiver to fulfill their emotional need and fulfill that emotional feedback loop. And by virtue of all these different mechanisms that were taking place in our family, the relationship between my brother and I became very, very violent. And as we grew into adolescence, it became very abusive. And so I was the younger brother, and so now, even though there's sort of this picture-perfect household, there's something very, very dark happening behind that curtain. And it's not to say that my parents weren't there to try to navigate it. They were, but they didn't know really what to do. And the thing that we're in such a trauma-forward culture now, where everybody knows about their trauma, they talk about their trauma, which is great, by the way. One of the things we don't understand is that oftentimes trauma is in what you don't experience as much as what you do experience. So if you're a little kid and you're trapped in a sort of a toxic stress environment that's violent and you don't feel protected, that gets interpreted in yourself as neglect, right? So you don't feel safe. So you learn all these maladaptive coping mechanisms. But also what's interesting about that is that in that dynamic, I learned that, well, if my brother kicks the shit out of me, I get attention, right? And so then I get those emotional needs met. And so then I start participating in that dynamic. So I start picking at him a little bit, right? To get the shit kicked out of me, right? So you're co-authoring this stuff. But at the time, did I know that I was doing that? No. But that's what ultimately led to, when I was 12, and again, I want to make it very clear, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a therapist. So this is stuff that I've learned, this is how I interpret these things. But you can see as the violence started to get more and more severe, and the rage was more and more palpable, what happened was, that's when I first got diagnosed with anxiety. And that's when I got diagnosed with depression. And that's when I first got medicated. And then, as I got into, as I finally dropped out of high school altogether, I got put in this long-term rehab facility for troubled teens, and they diagnosed me with bipolar 2. And that's a diagnosis I've carried for a very long time and lived with my whole life. And so was I self-aware enough at the time to see that? No, of course not. I'm a fucking teenager who's off the rails. And it's taken a long time to unwind that and start to see the sort of different levers and mechanisms that were perpetuating all this. You know what I mean?
Absolutely, and not being self-aware of this, so did you think at the time that you were just a normal kid, that you had a normal life with a normal family?
No. I don't know, I think a lot of us can relate to this, like we're a very intellectually focused culture, and I think what happens when we're young is we sort of disconnect. We start using our minds more than our hearts and our bodies, and we become very sort of disintegrated, if that makes any sense. But I just always very much felt like I was on the outside looking in. And our family wasn't normal in that, like, how do I say it? Yes, we were normal, and no, we were not normal. My parents were dedicated to providing my brother and I with opportunities that would ultimately pay off later in life. Like, we were very, they took us backpacking in the summers and stuff. And this was part of the issue, is that it looks like it's all picture perfect, right? But that also wasn't normal, in a good way. And the violence wasn't normal, in a bad way. And the rage wasn't normal, and the sort of feelings of neglect, and then also, being in rehab isn't necessarily normal. So, and the interesting thing about that is that when you're a teenager and you get put in those situations, the story, even though they're trying to help, the story that you're learning is that you're somehow broken and fucked up, right? And that's a story that you start to tell and live with and hold for the rest of your life.
And this was 25 years ago or so the stigma around getting help, getting medication, going to rehab is a lot different than it is maybe this were to happen right now.
Oh yeah, I mean we're so much more resourced now. But it's also important to remember at that time, like, this was a time when diagnosing kids was, like, bipolar was the diagnosis. In the mid-90s, it was like the banner diagnosis for any kid who was out of control. Oh, they're bipolar. And now we've switched to things like ADHD, which is interesting because they're very, very closely intertwined. But yeah, we're much more resourced now, but still there's a huge stigma around this. But then again, all of this ended up in many ways paying off to my benefit. Like, I'm very grateful for it.
A lot of lessons learned in life for you. You mentioned going back into the mountains with your dad and your brother. That ultimately led to you seeking a lot of thrills through your life. What lessons did you learn on the mountains from a young age, going with your dad and your brother? You mentioned in the book that every day was a school day on the mountains. So you were able to kind of absorb a lot.
Well, no, I didn't learn a lot of lessons when I was younger. I mean, I thought I did, right? But like, it only started to make sense like later on when I became a professional climber, when I was doing things like Everest and climbing in the Himalaya, that I started to see how this sort of the aggregate of what I had learned when I was a kid. Does that make sense? Like, it was, when you're learning shit, it doesn't, a lot of times it doesn't really make sense until you're looking back on it. But a lot of that was just, there's the base levels of like how to stay safe in the mountains, but then there's also like, I was more interested in later on, I was more interested in why the fuck am I doing this? Like, why am I continuing to go out and put myself in very dangerous situations? Like, it's almost as if there was, you know, people often talk about a death wish. I don't think of it that way, but there was very much like, why am I so drawn to nearly killing myself all the time?
You're searching for something that, every time you go out there, you search for something and you wouldn't always find it too. I mean, that was probably the thing that keeps you going as well, because you'll hike it on and you'll go to the top, you'll go to Everest, but something still doesn't fill that void.
Yeah, I mean, so who in here is like familiar with the hero's journey? Because not, yeah, like Joseph Campbell's work, he talks about the basis of storytelling in humanity is basically a protagonist is called to a journey. And they either make the choice to go out and do it, or they don't. And if you don't make that choice to go sort of slay the dragon, sail the sea, or whatever, it's a life unfulfilled. And then so it's basically every single movie you watch, this is how the acts break down. It's a 3-act thing. You know, there's this instigating chapter, the first act, then you're placed upon a precipice. You either take the journey or you don't. And if you take the journey, that's when all this sort of fun stuff happens, the montages in the movie, right? And then there's a cataclysm towards the end of the second act where everything goes to shit and it all falls apart, right? And then it's called the dark night of the soul, right? And everything crumbles. And it's in that moment when you make the decision to overcome those hurdles that you transcend. So if you look at stories throughout history, mythological stories, whether it's Buddha or Jesus, they all follow, or Greek mythology, they all follow this identical arc, right? And so when I started to reflect sort of on my life, I started to see that these stories were, you know, I was basically following that. And yet I'd get to the end of the second act, and every time I'd sort of burn it down. Like I had to learn the lessons over and over and over again. And a lot of those lessons were really painful. And to the point where, you know, going through divorce or whatever it was, I build up this life, I build up something really, really great, and then I would just torch it all. And I'm like, why the fuck am I doing this?
Yeah, so kind of self-sabotage.
Total self-sabotage. I mean, who in here knows what, I'm assuming you all can raise your hand if I go, have you ever self-sabotaged something? Yeah, we're like good at it. And here's the thing, we try so hard to stay the same. We're always like, oh, I want to change so bad. We're actually trying really fucking hard to stay the same, which is why we torch shit. Because right at that point, that's where we're going to change. And we're like, no, that's too much, I want to burn it down. So I have to start all over again. Does that make sense? It's really
The fear of change, somewhere subconsciously stops the change will actually happen.
Absolutely. Yeah, we just keep, we're like, oh, I've done it, but not quite. I don't, no, I'm going to stay the same.
You went through a lot as you read on in the book, and you'll see all the journeys that Cory went through. Take me through the biggest part in your life that you were able to look back on and say, wow, that was the point where I turned the corner, I stopped maybe some of that self-sabotage, and you're kind of aware that this was maybe my turning point in life.
Okay, so
That's a loaded question.
yeah, no, there's many of them.
Take it.
But I'll say the book starts in, and I'm not, spoiler, but I'm here. So I'm in an avalanche, and we're in Pakistan, and it's the middle of winter, and we're climbing a mountain called Gasherbrum 2, which is the 13th highest mountain in the world. And we've just climbed it, and we're coming down, we've gotten hit by a storm, and we're moving from Camp 1 back down to base camp, and we get hit by this massive avalanche. There's just 3 of us, there's nobody else on the mountain, and it's like, I'm dying. Like, I knew I was dying. I knew that's what was happening. There was nothing else, that was just it. So your brain does all sorts of crazy things when it starts to grapple with the fact that you are going to die. And obviously I didn't. I was buried up to my neck, and one of the other guys was buried up to basically up to his shoulders and could get out. And then he could dig me out and my partner out. And so I took this photograph right after, and because I was like, something's happening internally, and the camera was always the way I tried to, it was something I used to try to understand what was happening. So I took a picture of myself, and then that whole thing blew up in a very like beautiful way. Like it pushed me into my career. It moved the dial in a lot of ways. And yet, that was the point from which I started to really dive into like, what does PTSD look like? And what does trauma look like? And how does it present? Because right after that, my life started to just unravel like cataclysmically. You know, my career went way uphill really fast. And then my internal life just started to die. To the point where I felt like I was being pulled apart in the middle. And what was being presented on the outside was not congruent or in alignment with what was happening on the inside. And so that's a huge inflection point. But it took over a decade for me to really understand what had happened in that moment and the reason why that avalanche had affected me so profoundly and my partners not at all in regards to things like trauma. And you start to dig back and you go, well, when we're brought up in highly volatile situations, when we're brought up with a lot of trauma, we're more likely to experience things like PTSD. And it doesn't have to be an avalanche, it doesn't have to be combat, it doesn't have to be any of that, it can be a tiny event. And it triggers us into this deeply maladaptive fight or flight response where we're living in our basically a dysregulated nervous system, living in our amygdala, and our prefrontal cortex is just completely offline, right? So, but it took that experience and the aftermath of that, which included divorce, which included, horrible career decisions, which included more and more extreme shit where I was nearly dying, all the way up until I basically had a full-on breakdown because I was trying to essentially climb my way out of it, or do my way out of the internal experience that was taking place inside. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah, it does. Because that is such a big point where you come out of that avalanche and it's kind of a fork in the road in a sense, where you look at everything from a different perspective, you have more gratitude for everything that you have, and that can also lead you down two different paths, where you look at everything as gratitude, or maybe the opposite way as well. And you can say, oh well, why didn't that change?
Well, that's the thing. And truthfully, because my career blew up in such an interesting way, like in a good way, all this shit just started coming to me, and I didn't really have to work for it. I would just, now I was working for the biggest magazine in the world. Now I was, doing TV shows. Now I was doing all this shit, right? And it's really easy to just get distracted by that stimulus. It was so easy to get wrapped up into it and forget how special it was. And the irony of that is people will come up to me all the time and they're like, oh, you shoot for National Geographic, that's the best job in the world. And yet internally, I was like, why do I feel nothing? And then you start having to go harder and harder and harder to feel anything at all. And then, because you're not feeling anything there, then this is my story anyway, I come back and I was just like empty inside. When I wasn't working, I was just empty. And so then I started drinking a lot, right? Just to numb that dull hum of just, it was so intolerable to just be in silence and be with myself. So then I just started drinking a lot to numb that out, right? And then, so now, I've got the best job in the world, but somehow I'm in rehab again at 35 years old, trying to sort out all the shit that's happened. And questioning, how can I stand witness to so much and be so ungrateful? How can I not notice how beautiful this is? And it's taken 3 hard years since I stepped away from all of this, from my entire history, to really start to ground in how fucking magnificent this experience is. That we can be sitting on a lawn in the desert, and there's plenty of water and food around, and we're sitting here listening to stories, listening to music. Meanwhile, so much of the world is telling us everything's fucked. And it's not. It's not. Most things actually aren't fucked. I have a shirt I made that just says everything is not fucked. Because I'm sick of this narrative that things are so cataclysmic. Yes, there are big problems in the world, of course. And I know that this is a very comfortable position to talk from, but what I started to see is how much is constantly around me that's worthy of gratitude. But it's ironic that I had to stop like looking for shit through the camera to finally start seeing how special this is. It's a strange irony.
And you've been to some beautiful places too. You know, you've been to the tops of mountains, taking photographs, again, through the lenses. You say in the book that you are making pictures. And sometimes the common term is taking pictures. Why the change? Why the M instead of the T from your perspective?
That's a really good point. Well, a lot of pictures are taken, right? We're just like, you know, we just like, it's a moment. We just like flash through it and we pick it up and we move on. But I think of photography as I try to be mindful. I don't think it's presence. People always think, oh, you have to be present. I think that's bullshit. I think you're in sort of a state of creative flow, which is different than being actually present, right? And my very first photography teacher was like, he just said, great pictures are not taken, they're made. Which means, you know, you're paying attention. It's not a reactive, it's not reflexive, it's thoughtful. And so I always try to do that. I try to make pictures because my art was just all about like catching moments as they felt best.
From a young age, what was it that you wanted to do in life? Well, I know you ended up becoming a photographer, you chased a career, you had a career, but what was the dream when you were young?
This is going to sound super fucked up in a little bit. I wanted to be a horse. No, I'm just,
The one right over there.
yeah. No, I actually wanted to be a professional climber because that's what, you know, we had that in our family, and I wanted to make art. So I wanted to climb mountains, I wanted to explore shit, and I wanted to make art. And both those things happened. Early on, I wanted to be a cultural anthropologist. I was obsessed with like the indigenous tribes of America. I would like bead shit and like make headdresses, and I was a very strange child. But then I ultimately got what I wanted, and I realized that the doing was less important than the being in it.
What was the point for you? What was kind of the last straw where you kind of said, okay, well, I did it, and now I'm going to move on into a different direction?
So we were trying to do, so there's so much, my head's like kind of a whirlpool right now. So when I started climbing in the Himalaya, the way this works is like, you start on smaller mountains and then you work out. And finally, of course, at some point you're going to be like, well, I kind of want to climb Everest. So, but because there was a piece of me that didn't want to do it the way that it's usually done. So I decided I wanted to climb Everest without oxygen. So to give you guys a sense, like, I think it's maybe 2% of Everest summits are done without oxygen. So it's maybe 200 people have done it total. So more people have been to space, which is kind of funny. And so I went to climb Everest in 2016 to do it without oxygen. And my partner, we were on summit day. What that means is you never touch oxygen the whole time you're there. You can't like use it a little bit on the way. It means you don't touch it. And so we left for the summit. We've been there for 6 weeks at this point. We're above, 27,000 feet. It's 12 a.m. And we leave for the summit, and slowly we get further and further apart. And I'm ahead of him. And so eventually we're just communicating by our radios, and finally he turns around. So now I'm climbing in the middle of the night without oxygen on Everest, and this is not like those pictures you see where there's like Skittles lined up to the summit. I was the only person there. And so I got to the top, and I'm alone, and I sat there for about 7 minutes, and I sort of had this moment of, realization, I guess in hindsight, that like I had literally climbed to the highest place on the planet in the hardest way I could imagine, and I still couldn't get away from myself. I was still just me, and there was still all this bullshit that I was running from. And I could have learned in that moment, I could have taken that lesson and been like, you know what, this is it, I've done it, I've done the thing, I don't have to do it anymore. But instead, I kept trying. But now that I'd done without oxygen, I was like, all right, let's try and climb it by a way that nobody has ever climbed it before. Like a route that nobody's ever done. So then we started scoping routes on the mountain that nobody had ever climbed. And so I went and I tried one, I failed. Then COVID happened, and we were training, and we were meant to go back. Every season got canceled, and we were like, well, let's do a dry run on the 7th highest mountain in the world. So we went to a mountain called Dolagiri. And we were in base camp. I hadn't been sleeping, I hadn't been eating. And I got sick. And I had what's called a mixed episode. And in bipolar, you can have these episodes where you're both wildly ignited. You know, you're manic or hypomanic, right? And you're also suicidally depressed at the same time. So you've got these incredible racing thoughts that you can't track. You can't hold on to anything. Your mind is literally ballistically loud with all these big ideas and rumination, and at the same time you want to fucking die. And it's like, and it was horrifying. And I was sitting there, the realization was, I think, prompted by this episode, or maybe it worked concurrently, where I was like, none of this works. I'm chasing the tail of a dragon that I've already slayed, if that makes any sense. I've done this thing, and I'm living out of alignment with myself and my truest desires, which ultimately, back to your question of what do I want to be? I just want to be a fucking good person who's putting good things into the world. And all of that had become so self-absorbed, and it was so, it was about my ego, it was about my identity, it was about, look at what I can do. And I realized that was so far out of alignment with who I wanted to be, that I literally forced myself, I think consciously or subconsciously, into a breakdown, into a crisis. And what's really interesting is that crisis is the point of growth. We always want to try to avoid crisis, but crisis is where we actually grow. So I had forced myself into crisis, and that's when I decided to let it all go. I was like, I'm putting away the cameras. I own 2 cameras now. I'm not going to climb anymore for a very long time. I need to sort this out. And then the interesting thing was, now I don't have a fucking identity. Now I don't know who I am. Now I don't have anything to anchor myself to. And that I think is what the healing journey is all about. When you take that step to go, I'm gonna unmoor myself from everything that makes me feel safe and fucking float for a second. We don't like floating. It's really uncomfortable.
And it's a scary thought too. What have you been doing your entire life all of a sudden? I'm not gonna do it anymore. We'll see what happens. So what did you do from that point? What's the healing journey been like for you since that day?
Well, it's such a great question, because like when I do talks, like I have all these incredible pictures, right? It's basically I hoodwink people into talking about healing by showing them walruses, or showing them climbing mountains, right? And the funny thing is, at the point in the talk where you actually get to the healing part, there's no more pictures, because I stopped doing it. And so I came back to the States. I flew back, and I was a wreck, and I tried to kill myself, and I realized that so much of the therapy and living in this therapeutic world for so long, my mom took me to see a therapist when I was 1. I don't know what that means. It's incredible, but I was living in this narrative of brokenness for a very, very long time. And I had started attaching myself to, I'm bipolar. Now I'm an alcoholic, and I am all of these things, right? And I was living in this narrative of sort of brokenness. And when I came back, I started this slow process of going, okay, I know what my trauma is, but by telling that story over and over and over and over again, I'm actually reinforcing it. I'm still living in it. It's not moving beyond it. And it's very seductive, especially in this day and age where we learn about this stuff, and then we just regurgitate it. We keep telling the story of our trauma, and we become trapped in that narrative, learning how to step back from the story. And that involved, and I'm not supposed to talk about this because I don't have a doctor on stage, by the way, but that did involve psychedelics. I started using ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. I'm not, I'll just say from my experience, it was literally a life-saving drug. It was so strange. And I did this under the supervision of nurse practitioners, all the, therapists, and I did it, and it's as if like I woke up afterwards and I was like, holy shit, is this what normal people feel like? Is this like, it was like I had taken, a 100-pound backpack off, and I was like, is this how normal people operate? Like, I felt gratitude for the first time in a very long time. And that gave me some distance to be able to step back and start really examining the stories that I've been telling. But I didn't know what I was gonna do. So I moved to LA. I don't know why I did that.
That's what you do.
Yeah, that's what you do when you're in crisis. You move to LA. Yeah. I'm gonna be a movie star. So I moved to LA because I was like, well, I want to pursue different forms of art. And I moved out here, and of course, it doesn't happen like that. And so I started writing, and all of a sudden, a couple chapters sort of started emerging. And those chapters started stringing together, and then I was like, oh shit, I think I'm writing a book. And that took 3 years to actually do, and at first there's all this fear, I'm like, what? Like, I don't want to write it, that's so, like, self-congratulatory. But at the end of the day, it wasn't even about trying to celebrate myself, it was about trying to get this shit out of me and trying to understand it. But ultimately it arrives at, like, the premise of what story is. You know what I mean?
So you said before too, when you talk about trauma and kind of the pictures go away. So is this book, in a sense, like, here are the stories, and I can kind of walk away from everything and get back to where I really want to be?
Yeah. I mean, I think that it takes, especially when we have something that makes us feel really good about ourselves, it's hard to let it go. But it might be feeding some parts of us that actually aren't that healthy. So the way I wrote it, and this is, I know it's annoying because you guys can't even have the book yet, it comes out in July, but I promise, buy it if you hate it, you can use it for kindling, you can roll cigarettes with the paper, I don't give a shit, but like, really the way it works is like a 3-layered onion, right? So the outer layer is my life story and all this kind of fun, cool shit that happened. And the next layer is about mental health, what happens in the brain and why, but the central nugget is its story. And story is human consciousness. We don't understand how impactful story is. But every morning we wake up and we tell ourselves a story about ourselves, about our relationships, about the world we live in, about how that world impacts us. It's all a story. It doesn't mean it's not true. It just means it's a story. And the cool thing about stories is they're changeable. And so it gets back to this idea of the narratives around mental health, living in this idea of, I'm sick. Well, that's a story. That's a definitive, right? Versus, my brain functions in a specific way that I navigate. That's a journey, right? These are very, very different things. I am an addict. That's a pretty heavy story. I navigate some addictive qualities, so it's better for me to abstain. That's a journey. You see what I mean? It's a very subtle shift. And when you start stepping back from a little bit, you go, wait, what stories am I telling that actually aren't helping me anymore? And I think that's been the beauty of the process, is understanding, oh shit, this is all a story. It's all a value application, really. So, you go to Coachella and you have a good time or you have a bad time. Really, the only thing that's true about that is you went to Coachella, right? Good and bad are value applications based on what happened there. And we apply those things, and those stories are up for grabs. See, does that make sense to anybody, or do you guys think I'm on acid now? Right? Like,
You've got a couple things back there.
Yeah. It's just hitting. No.
You mentioned the onion layering of it. You mentioned in the book that you refer to yourself as a Russian doll. I like that analogy quite a bit because you do have all these different things that are inside of you. You still, you have to pull back one layer to get to the next one, and the next one.
Yeah.
And that was a really interesting metaphor that I think there are a lot of metaphors that I don't know different.
Well, the Russian doll, we're all Russian dolls, right? We're those things. You take off one layer and then there's another. But the question is, what's at the center? You know? Eventually you get to one that's solid. Eventually you get to one that's pure, that doesn't have another layer on top of it. And I think ultimately with healing, we talk about healing so misunderstood that we're going to arrive at some place where we're perfect. No, that's not the way fucking life works. It's not. But I do believe there's a pure center of us, and when we can touch it, when we can get to that place, and when we see how, and I believe this, how good we actually are, just by the virtue of being alive, that's when we really start to let go of all the layers on top of us. They become less sticky, they become less calcified, but it takes work. And the irony is that little central nugget, that very solid center, is unchanging. And it's always there and it's always accessible, but it takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of vigilance to get into it. And pain.
So now that the book is coming out in July, you have everything out there, what's next? What's the next plan for you in your journey?
So this is funny. This question always happens. This is what's next? You know, what are you gonna do now? And I love it and I hate it because,
But it's a good way to start.
yeah, no. I'm just gonna enjoy this. Like it took a lot to get here, and I'd be an idiot if I was like, well, I'm gonna go climb some more mountains, you know, because I've learned that lesson. I might do that in the future. I might take some more pictures. Who knows? But what I'm focused on right now is just being present with what's happening and allowing the world around me to influence me and that influence allowing or informing how I want to interact with the world. We always talk about like, I want to change the world. It's kind of fucking arrogant. I mean, I want to let the world change me, and I want to be mindful of how it does it, and I want to allow that information to then inform how I put things out into the world. And so what do I want to do now? I mean, it's a sunny day at Coachella. I probably want to take my shirt off for a minute, although I'm not appropriately dressed. Maybe I'll buy a sparkly cowboy hat, and I don't know, and I think that's enough. Like, I think, we were talking earlier, back to this thing about gratitude. I know we're almost out of time here, but like, the biggest thing that I've taken from all of this is that at any moment, the world around us is infinitely worthy of gratitude. And we miss it. We miss it because we're so used to it, right? But here we are. Think about not just how many people it took to put this tent together. Just so you can sit here in the shade, right? Think about all the people that had to conceptualize and then think about how are we going to make metal? Like, how far back does this go so we can make these things? Now we've got all this incredible technology. How many people did it take throughout history to bring this short experience together so we can sit here and talk about stuff? All of that is worthy of gratitude. Every single thing and every single moment around you, even if it's hard, there's always nuggets of gratitude. And so my journey right now, my goal right now is not just launching a book and doing all this shit, is really noticing that. That's the thing I'm working on doing next, is just noticing how fucking marvelous this is. And it really is. I mean, it's really, really, really special. This whole experience. We're given two things. We're given one thing. We're given time. We don't know how much we get. Story is what fills it up. Be mindful of the story you choose. And take a moment to just appreciate how fucking great it is. I mean, that might be too simplistic, but it doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. But you know what I mean?
It's always a great way to look around things and feel about things. And Cory, we appreciate you sharing your story with us here today. The book is The Color of Everything. It's out this July. You follow Cory on Instagram.
Yeah, Cory Richards, C-O-R-Y, no E. It doesn't E in Cory.
We don't need extra extra vowels.
Yeah, no vowel, no extra vowels.
Especially how quick we have to text and stuff.
That's
like that.
excessive.
So I appreciate you having a very short first name.
Yeah.
As do I. Just 4 letters.
Yeah.
That's great.
4 letters. Cory's a 4-letter word. That's what my dad used to say.
Well, thank you everyone for coming out and listening to Cory tell his story. Again, the book is everything is out this July. Thanks for having us. Stick around for some more great talks. So enjoy the day today.
Photo, you guys.